something about this story feels off. It's not just a vague feeling, it's a pattern that keeps repeating itself quietly across centuries, cutting through empires, wars, coronations, and the scoot of entire civilizations. A pattern that connects ancient kings, aristocratic families, and modern figures of power as if they all share something in common, something that was never supposed to survive. What if everything you've been taught about royal bloodlines is incomplete? What if, behind those carefully documented genealogies, there's another line, hidden, protected, manipulated, a lineage that isn't entirely human? The first whisper of forbidden legacy. Ancient records, forgotten texts, and fragmented traditions from around the world all point to the same idea. Beings that didn't fully belong to Earth. They weren't gods, but they weren't human either. And what makes this even more unsettling is what came next. These beings, described across different cultures under different names, didn't just visit humanity. They intertwined with it. They had offspring. They created a new bloodline, a hybrid lineage, a lineage that carried something different in its blood. Now, think about this for a second. Why did so many ancient civilizations talk about divine kings? Why were pharaohs considered descendants of gods? Why did emperors demand their bloodlines be treated as sacred? This wasn't just political power. It was something deeper, something biological. The secret hidden in the crowns. If you look closely, you'll notice something. The most powerful families in history have always been incredibly closed off. Intermarriage, carefully calculated alliances, bloodlines guarded almost like living vaults. Why? It wasn't just tradition. It was preservation, preserving something specific, something that couldn't be diluted. For centuries, these families avoided mixing their blood with the general population, and when they did, it was always controlled, as if they knew they were protecting something rare, something valuable, something different. Anomalies that shouldn't exist. Now here's the part almost no one talks about. Throughout history, there are persistent reports of unusual traits among members of royalty. Unusual height for their time, strange cranial structures, rare genetic conditions, extreme psychological behaviors, a constant sense of being separate from ordinary humanity. For a long time, this was dismissed as coincidence or the result of inbreeding. But what if that's only part of the story? What if these anomalies are actually traces, fragments of something much older? Dynasties that never fall by accident. Look at the great dynasties throughout history. They didn't just rule. They shaped everything. Religion, culture, knowledge, historical narratives. And most importantly, they shaped how people understand the world. But here's the key detail. Even when a dynasty falls, something strange happens. The power never fully disappears. It just changes form. It changes names, faces, but the influence remains. Which raises a disturbing question. What if we're not dealing with separate families, but one continuous lineage, broken apart across time, yet connected by something unseen? Symbols that transcend time. Now, pay attention to this. The symbols. They're everywhere, and almost no one questions them. All-seeing eyes, pyramids, crowns with specific shapes, coats of arms filled with unusual geometry, mythological animals repeated across cultures. These symbols appear in civilizations that supposedly had no contact with each other. Egypt, Mesopotamia, medieval Europe, modern secret societies. Same patterns, same code, coincidence, or language. Because symbols aren't just decoration. They communicate, they carry meaning, they transmit knowledge, and in many cases, they act as a signature. But a signature of who? Rituals that never disappeared. Here's something else most people overlook. The rituals. They never went away. They just evolved. Coronation ceremonies, initiation rites, secret protocols. Traditions preserved for centuries, with no clear logical explanation. Many of these rituals involve oaths, ancient symbols, objects loaded with hidden meaning, structures repeated throughout history, and even more unsettling. They often take place far from public view. Why? If they're just traditions, why all the secrecy? History as a controlled script. Now let's connect the dots. And this is where things start to get really unsettling. What if history isn't just a natural sequence of events? What if it's guided, shaped, adjusted? What if major wars, power shifts, and social transformations are actually moves in a much older game? A game that started long before the first known civilizations. A game built on control. Control of territory. Control of knowledge. And above all, control of bloodlines. What they don't want you to see, if this lineage really exists, everything changes. It means global power might not be in the hands of who it appears to be. Certain families could be connected in ways never revealed. Official history may have been filtered, edited, rewritten, and most importantly, it suggests there may be an elite that doesn't see itself as part of ordinary humanity. Not entirely. The final hook. But here's where things get even more intense, because in the next part, we're going to follow the bloodline. We'll trace names, specific dynasties, connections that seem impossible, but aren't. And more than that, we're going to examine how this possible ancient inheritance might still be influencing global decisions. Right now. Here's the continuation, adapted into natural US-style English, keeping the same cinematic tone and flow. If what we've seen so far already feels unsettling, what comes next completely changes how you see power in this world. Because now, we're not just talking about ideas. We're talking about names, real families, dynasties you've heard of, but never looked at this way. The illusion of fallen empires' history teaches us that empires fall, that kings lose their thrones, that dynasties disappear. But does that really happen? Look closer. When a monarchy ends, what actually happens to that family? Do they vanish, or do they keep existing behind the scenes? Many of those names are still alive today, not as absolute rulers, but as owners of massive fortunes, political influencers deeply connected to financial institutions embedded in global power networks. In other words, the throne may disappear, but the bloodline doesn't. The obsession with purity. Now let's get into something that's rarely talked about openly. The obsession with keeping the bloodline pure. For centuries, European royal families followed an extremely rigid pattern. Marriages between cousins, strategic unions between noble houses, rejection of any outside mixing. Officially, this was about maintaining political alliances. But in practice, it created something very specific, a closed system of genetic preservation, which raises an uncomfortable question. Why go to such lengths? To keep the blood within such a tight circle? If this were just about politics, outside alliances would have been far more beneficial. But no, the priority was something else. Preserving something. Something invisible. Something that couldn't be lost. Interconnected dynasties. Now connect the dots. The major royal houses of Europe, the ones that ruled the world for centuries, were all linked. Not just politically, but biologically. Family lines crossing over again and again, generation after generation maintaining the same genetic core, which means that even with different names, we might actually be looking at a single massive family tree, split into different houses, but deeply connected. And if you go back even further, those connections start pointing to something much older. Echoes of ancient civilizations. Egypt, Sumer, Babylon, civilizations that appeared with advanced knowledge, almost out of nowhere. Highly organized societies. Ruling elites who claimed divine origins. Pharaohs weren't just kings. They were seen as living gods, intermediaries between heaven and earth. Now think about this. What if that idea wasn't just symbolic? What if those leaders truly believed they carried something different in their blood? Something inherited from a non-human origin? A pattern that never changes. The most unsettling part isn't just the existence of these stories. It's the pattern. It's always the same. An elite claiming superior origin, a closed reproduction system, specific symbols tied to power, initiation rituals, a clear divide between rulers and the ruled. This shows up across different parts of the world, across different eras, with no direct contact between them. Yet the consistency is hard to ignore. Coincidence or continuity. Control beyond visible power. Now let's take it further, because real power isn't just political. It's narrative. Whoever controls history controls how reality is perceived. For centuries, these elites had exclusive access to education, historical records, knowledge production, religious institutions, which means they didn't just rule territories. They shaped how people understood the world itself. And if there was something that needed to be hidden, they had every tool necessary to do it. What was erased? How many records were lost? How many stories were altered? How many truths were buried beneath official versions? The history we know might not be false, but it could be incomplete. And sometimes, what's left out matters more than what's told. Now we reach the most sensitive point. These bloodlines aren't just part of the past. They're still here. Many historically powerful families still hold global economic influence, deep political connections, presence in international institutions, access to extremely exclusive circles, and here's the most intriguing part. They're still connected to each other. Modern marriages between influential families still follow similar patterns. Less visible, more discreet, but still strategic. Discrete societies, real power. Throughout history, organizations have emerged that operate far from public view. Selective groups, invitation only, strict hierarchies. Many of them share ancient symbols, initiation, rituals, rigid internal structures, and often they're linked to highly powerful individuals, which reinforces a disturbing idea. Real power may not sit in visible institutions, but in parallel networks. What all of this suggests. If you put all the pieces together, you get a picture that completely challenges the traditional view of history, a possible ancient bloodline, preserved across centuries, protected by dynasties, hidden by official narratives, and still active today, not as an obvious empire, but as a constant, quiet, strategic influence. Final hook, but this is still just the surface, because in the next part, we're going to step into the most controversial territory of all, the so-called genetic anomalies. We'll look at specific accounts, unusual physical traits, and theories that try to explain whether there really is something different in this blood, and more importantly, whether those differences are just coincidence or evidence of something that was never fully human. The anomalies that can't be ignored. Up to this point, we've been following patterns, bloodlines, symbols, power structures. But now, we're going deeper. We're talking about what's inside the body, inside the blood. Because if this lineage was truly preserved, it would have left marks, traces, physical or biological signs. And this is exactly where the most unsettling reports begin to surface. Throughout history, members of royal and aristocratic families have been described in surprisingly similar ways, not just in behavior, but in appearance. Ancient accounts and historical records mention traits like unusually tall stature for their time, uncommon skull shapes, facial structures seen as different, extremely pale skin, unusual sensitivity to light. For a long time, this was dismissed as exaggeration or romanticized views of nobility. But not all records can be brushed off that easily, especially when patterns start repeating, strange behavior, or inherited traits. There's another piece that rarely gets discussed: psychological behavior. Many historical accounts describe members of royalty as emotionally cold, obsessed with control, detached from the general population, convinced of their natural superiority. Sure, some of that can be explained by the environment they were raised in, but what if that's not the whole story? What if there's something deeper, something that influences not just the body, but the mind? Genetic disorders, or something more? Now we're stepping into more sensitive territory. Generations of intermarriage within the same families led to well-documented consequences: rare diseases, physical deformities, neurological issues, biological fragility. But here's the key detail: these same bloodlines continued the pattern, even knowing the risks. Why? If it were just ignorance, this behavior would have been corrected over time. But it wasn't, which suggests a priority greater than health: preservation. Something had to remain intact, even at a high cost. The most controversial theory. And this is where the most radical idea comes in. What if these anomalies aren't just consequences, but evidence? What if these bloodlines carry traces of something that doesn't fully belong to standard human genetics? Something ancient, something hybrid, something that over centuries has been diluted, but never completely disappeared. That would explain the obsession with purity, the repetition of family patterns, the physical and behavioral differences, the constant sense of separation between elites and the general population. Of course, this can't be directly proven, and maybe it never will be. The problem with investigation. If this hypothesis were true, it would be incredibly difficult to prove. Why? Because the very bloodlines that would be involved are the same ones that have historically controlled scientific institutions, historical records, access to information, official narratives. In other words, if there were something to hide, they would have every tool needed to hide it. What's shown, and what's hidden? Modern science gives us a lot of answers, but it also has limits, especially when certain topics are labeled as taboo, conspiratorial, socially sensitive. This creates a situation where some questions simply aren't asked or aren't taken seriously, and that keeps the mystery alive. The psychological factor. Now think about something important. Even if none of this is literally true, the belief itself is powerful. If an elite believes it is different, superior, born from a special origin, that belief shapes decisions. It shapes how they govern. It shapes how they see the rest of humanity. And in the end, the outcome may be the same. The us versus them mindset. This idea of separation shows up again and again throughout history. An elite that sees itself as chosen, superior, destined to rule, and a population seen as ordinary, subordinate, replaceable. Regardless of where this comes from, the result is clear: control, final hook. And now we've reached the most important point of all, because in the final part, we're going to bring everything together. We'll move beyond theory and look at the real-world impact. If this lineage, whether literal or symbolic, still exists, what does that mean for the world today? Who's really in control? And, more importantly, is there any way to break this cycle, or was it never meant to be broken? The system that was never broken. Now stop for a moment. Take a breath and look at everything that's been laid out so far. Preserved bloodlines, patterns repeating across thousands of years, symbols that span entire civilizations, rituals that never disappeared, and possible traces within the blood itself. If all of this is just coincidence, then it's the most unlikely chain of coincidences in human history. But what if it's not? The idea that we live in an open system where anyone can rise to power, it's comforting. But is it real? Throughout history, power has rarely been distributed. It's been inherited, protected, passed down, not just through merit, but through belonging. And that leads to the most unsettling possibility of all. The world may not be run by institutions alone, but by networks. Invisible networks, connected by blood, influence, and interests that span generations. You don't need a throne to rule. If you control banks, narratives, education, culture, technology, you shape reality. And if those same bloodlines are present, directly or indirectly within these pillars, then power never actually changed hands. It just evolved from crowns to corporations, from empires to global systems. But the core remains the same. If there really is an ancient inheritance behind all of this, it doesn't need to be visible. It could exist as a genetic code, a hidden tradition, a belief passed down through generations, or a combination of all of the above. What matters isn't just whether it's real, but the fact that it's been protected, hidden, preserved. Why? Because knowledge is power, but origin is something even more dangerous. Now we reach the core of it all. If certain bloodlines have been protected for thousands of years, who really decides who rules? Is it choice or continuity? Do you actually choose your leaders? Or are you just choosing between options already defined by an invisible system? If you look closely, the pattern repeats. Crises, shifts in power, global restructuring, the rise of new leaders, but underneath it all, the structures remain. This doesn't look like collapse. It looks like maintenance, a system that adapts but never breaks. Now, here's a critical shift. What if this isn't literally about genetics? What if the real inheritance is knowledge, strategy, control of information, manipulation of narratives, and blood is just the symbol, used to keep the structure intact? That would make it even more powerful, because it wouldn't depend on biology. It would depend on continuity. Maybe the biggest secret isn't the existence of a bloodline, but the fact that most people never question anything. They accept history as it's told. They accept the system as it's presented. They accept power as something distant, unreachable. And that is exactly what keeps everything running. But the moment you start questioning things, everything changes. You begin to see patterns, connections, inconsistencies, and most importantly, you realize the world may be far more structured and controlled than it appears. Whether this lineage is real, or whether the entire system was built around the idea of it, the outcome is the same. A highly resilient power structure, difficult to trace, nearly impossible to break, but not invisible, because the signs are always there, patterns always emerge, and history always leaves traces. So, now I'll leave you with a question. Do you think all of this is just coincidence? Or is something much older operating behind the scenes of history? If this video made you see the world differently, if you started connecting dots that once felt disconnected, then it was already worth it. And if you want to keep exploring these mysteries, to dive deeper into everything they never told you, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because here, we don't settle for the surface version of history. We go after what's hidden. See you in the next video.